Welcome to Books at Berklee. I'm Judith Pinnolis, Associate Director for Instruction and Engagement at the Berklee Library College of Music. Today we have with us Jonathan L. Friedmann, PhD, who is a professor of Jewish music history and Dean of the Master of Jewish Studies program at the Academy for Jewish Religion in California. He is also director of the Jewish Museum of the American West, president of the Western States Jewish History Association, and author and editor of 30 books on music, the Hebrew Bible, and the sociology of religion. Welcome, Dr. Friedmann.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I am going to be talking today about the book, Music and Human Experience, Perspectives on a Musical Species. And you were the editor of this book. Tell me a little bit about how this book came about, Music and Human Experience. How did you get involved?
Great question. This is one of the rare instances where I was recruited by the publisher to put this book together. They had already received a couple of chapters and were thinking about expanding it into a proper volume, which ended up being this 350-page book. I guess it's the closest I've come to that sort of famous Cole Porter question when he was asked, "What is your inspiration?" And he says, a phone call from the producer. It was kind of like that. Not that there's any money to be made with this kind of stuff, but it was kind of good timing for me. It was a pandemic project. In fact, one of many. Before 2020, I was driving maybe 500 miles a week for commuting, and I suddenly had all this free time. And I sort of surprised myself. I think I published 8 books between 2020 and 2022, 5 of them authored, 3 of them edited. And then I also became the editor of the relaunched journal, Western States Jewish History. So it kind of just fit into a larger, aggressive writing project to basically keep myself busy during those times. So I think in preparing for this book, I was given a very broad kind of plate or whatever to fill. And, how far could I stretch this, I think was my notion. Music and human life, we know that music and human beings go together very well. We're a musical species. So how far can we stretch the boundaries in this topic? I think that was kind of what excited me. I'd done a lot of work in this area before. I guess that's why I was recruited, but being able to bring in scholars who were also asking similar questions was really exciting.
Yeah, so this book is a series of 16 essays, and they're all written by different authors, scholars. I was going to ask, how did you see the purpose of the book overall? And how is that reflected in the collection that wound up in the book?
Yeah, great question. I kind of had 3 ideas in mind. One was to bring together senior scholars, people who are well-known in their fields, and newer voices, maybe people who don't write that much, but who are very active in creating music, or again, kind of stretching the boundaries of what music can be. So that was one thing, and I think I was successful in doing that. Another was to bring together authors, scholars from as many fields as I possibly could. I wanted to make this as interdisciplinary as possible. For some reason, the original subtitle, I wanted to be interdisciplinary perspectives on a musical species, but the interdisciplinary part apparently didn't fit their publishing guidelines. I like that word though, and I think that this book really reflects that. So evolutionary biologists, anthropologists, ethnomusicologists, psychologists, religious scholars, all kinds of people were brought in for this project. And then the third was kind of organically to put the different essays into conversation around central questions or central themes, very open-endedly, kind of without boundaries, but basically asking why and how human beings are musical was the overarching question. And then having the different scholars sort of answer that very huge question with their own scholarship in their own fields, their own disciplines, and kind of like what does your field have to say about this kind of a thing?
How and why humans are musical is a question that's definitely pervasive throughout the book. I was curious about the essays, that they were extensive in range in terms of all these different intersecting subject areas that touched on or intersected with music, but not necessarily with each other in a way. One of the aspects of the book is this extensive literature review. Each essay has a pretty good listing of other works, both as a literature review in the essay itself, as well as bibliographies, certainly making them very useful as standalone teaching and learning tools on any one of these subject areas for a college course. But I was also curious as to, kind of why that kind of extensive literature review is included. Was that part of the purpose, or did you see this as something that the authors wanted to do, or did they have free reign and that's just how it worked out, or what was going on with that?
That's a really great question. I think it must have been implied in the invitation I sent out, because you're right. I think most of the scholars, knowing that this was going to be very interdisciplinary and that readers wouldn't be experts on every subject in here, it's impossible. I'm not an expert in every subject in this book. It's one of the things that appeals to me about it, and I'm really proud to have my name on it. But yeah, I think the notion kind of, again, implicitly was you're going to get readers from different backgrounds, from different interest areas reading your piece. Why not kind of lead them into it and not expect that they're already experts, right? So to your point, I think that's correct. These can be read individually very profitably. I think you don't have to read all of them. Maybe something doesn't appeal to you, but something else hopefully will. But if you get into an article on, or an essay on something that you're not familiar with already, hopefully you'll come away with some good basis in that field, as well as whatever the author is adding to it, right? So it's a nice balance in that sense too, I think. And one of the reasons why I think this book is successful, if it is because of that very thing, that you can engage with it without prior expertise.
Yes. Going back to that question of how and why humans are musical, the book is not broken into sections, but kind of it has this thematic thread, if you will, going through it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit of what you hope the reader, if they do read the whole book in order, would be getting out of that, and how that was sort of organized for them.
Great question. And I think a couple of reviewers pointed that out as well. I think what I was thinking at the time was I kind of initially entertained the idea of dividing it up into sections, as a book typically is, part one, part two, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I started to see that as a rather artificial, or kind of a stretch to try to do that categorizing, because essays that appear later in the book probably do bounce well off of essays earlier and so forth. And I didn't necessarily see that as something I had the right to do in some ways. I know that sounds kind of weird, but my intention was really to let the eclectic nature of the volume speak for itself, rather than trying to shove the essays into different categories. But that being said, I didn't just throw them all together and mix them up and that kind of thing. There is a through line, I think, as you're alluding to, starting with essays on kind of proto-humans, prehistoric ancestors, and proto-music, going into more biological studies and into anthropology and cultural studies, and then finally reaching music composition, performance in the contemporary world. So there is an arc, there's a narrative arc, but again, I saw my job more as an organizer and not a kind of a dictatorial hand and kind of saying, well, this has to be here and this has to be there. I don't know if it's successful. I'm starting to doubt it, actually looking at it again. But, my hope was that the reader would come away with the idea that all these disciplines are in conversation and they're not siloed into the different subcategories.
Yeah, I kind of felt that opening essay with Bruno Nettle's essay laid out a philosophical premise that
Right.
each one of the articles did touch upon. And maybe you could talk to the audience a little bit about that foundational role that the first essay plays in tying the whole idea thread, these threads together. And also, today, so many things try to look at where intersection can happen between disciplines. And here, this is taking it on kind of as you say, an arc, a narrative arc with many disciplines all at once, but still having that one thread of music running between all of these different disciplines as a link between the disciplines. So
Yeah, I'm really glad you picked up on that. The Bruno Nettle article, of course, the late great Bruno Nettle, this is a republished piece that was recommended to me by one of the contributors, Joseph Jordania, who was a good colleague of Bruno's. And he thought it would be a good kind of template or a premise for the rest of the volume, or something to tie it together. And we decided, the two of us, to put it in the beginning. In fact, I sort of took a back seat to this opening essay. In my own introduction, I wanted to be very concise and very kind of superficial, because that was followed by Bruno Nettle, who says everything much better than me. So I really wanted that to be the focus and the central basis for the rest of the book. And it ended up working out, I think, pretty well. That particular essay asks, what are the great discoveries in the field of ethnomusicology? He lays out 8 of these things. These are, from years and decades of his own work and his colleagues, and even his predecessors. Things like, we shouldn't talk about music. We should talk about musics with an S. It's plural, right? The notion that music is, in fact, not universal. You're not going to understand someone else's music intuitively. In fact, maybe it's more like language, where we all have language, but doesn't mean I'm an expert in every language and I'll know what everyone's saying around the world. The sort of continuum of improvisation and composition and the interplay between them as being very central to music around, or musics around the world. And ideas like that. I think there are 8 points that he makes in that article. And, to a greater or lesser extent, I think those are points, without knowing it, that the authors bounce off of, because that essay came in later in the process as just sort of a nice way to frame the rest of the book. It wasn't that I sent it out to all the authors to reflect on. So it just kind of organically, intuitively worked out that way.
well, one of the essential ingredients in this book, and I really never thought that I was going to actually use this information right away, but it turned out that last week I was in a meeting, and the information in this book really was, and some of the essays and the ideas of this book were really brought up in a meeting I was in, and this relationship between the development of human biology and the development of music, and the interplay, kind of the chicken and egg thing, but also how they supported and helped each other develop in kind of a way. And each of these essays is talking a little bit about various relationships of music to humans in different ways. So would you talk a little bit about some of the various relationships that are brought out in the book, developmental and others that are brought out in this book, and some of the essays that you found interesting?
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, and I'm glad you're finding use for it. That's
I was
always
just I was surprised, but it was really nice.
I can say that's always the goal and not always the outcome. So I appreciate that. Well, I think you're right. The essays that focus more on the evolutionary biology are really fascinating. The notion that music sort of develops as our cognitive capacity as a species develops, and they kind of go hand in hand. The idea that we communicated perhaps with musical tones or something we would call proto-music long before we developed language as such. That kind of notion, the kind of pre-verbal, non-verbal communication that predates language proper. I think comparisons between conventions in language and music generally are really interesting, and those are brought up again in a biological context. And the notion that we really are just as much a musical species as we are a linguistic species. So when we're thinking about what distinguishes us from other species, certainly other non-human animals have kind of a proto-musical capacity as well. This is well documented in animal musicology, zoomusicology, et cetera. But what distinguishes us, I think, is how far we've taken that kind of biological basis and kind of stretched it. And I think those essays are really helpful for understanding some of the rest of the book as well, as things kind of get into the functional realm of ritual and communication and intimacy and relational uses of music, survival strategies, that kind of stuff. I think that all kind of makes sense when we're thinking about this as an evolutionary process that gives rise to even modern practices. I think one of the key takeaways perhaps is, the reason why we became a musical species may not be obvious to us anymore. We use music for other things now, maybe, and we're not even aware that at the basis of a lot of our even commercial music is a lot of this earlier impetus for music itself, the notion of bonding and communication and identity marking and all that stuff seems to be as old as proto-music itself.
Yeah, there's some of those things that really were bringing us back to thinking about how people develop culture at the very, very beginning levels, and how music was a part of that in every setting where humans were developing. Well, possibly, what do you see as some of the more important essays that you'd like to talk to our music students about in thinking about reading an essay in this book?
That's a great question. Obviously, I think all of the essays are important. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in there, right? And I'm sure I'm going to offend some of the authors by not mentioning theirs. But just for me personally, there are some that really spoke to me, and this will be different for any reader, hopefully. Something will speak to them as well. But just kind of on a sentimental level, Ellen de Sanayake's essay, she's been a very important scholar in my own work, and I was happy to have her contribute. She told me that her paper on lament and liminality is actually her final academic paper. She's done with that stuff. So wow. I'm happy to have the last of her, storied career kind of preserved in this book. And on the other hand, Robert Lopez Hanshaw, who's doing really incredible work in bringing microtonality into Western music, very exciting stuff that may interest some of your students. I think his essay on kind of the interplay of cultural evolution and cognitive bias in the process of musical change, it may be his first or close to his first article. So we have, again, like very new scholars, seasoned scholars, all mixed together in dialogue. Elizabeth Phillips and Stephen Brown's chapter on the role of physiological constraints on the evolution of musical scales is really important, I think, as a corrective or as a challenge to the more harmonic-based theories in that area. Nino Tsitsiashvili's chapter on sexual taboo is a revelation as well, challenging the notion that love songs as we have them evolved out of a sexual selection kind of Darwinian view. That may not be so, as she actually has a new book on that that just came out maybe a couple of weeks ago as well. Anyway, I could go on, but these are the ones that jumped out at me. And I think in general, the eclectic nature of the book, I think, should resonate with anyone who's interested in thinking a little more deeply about music. There's probably something in here for you. Maybe a bold statement, but I think there's enough in here to attract somebody or everybody,
I certainly thought so. I think that there's more than ethnomusicology and more than general musicology. I think there are things for people who are studying things like jazz and improvisation, who are doing things that are in music therapy, who are, in the different disciplines that our college at Berklee College has, and would have a wide range of interest to students from a number of disciplines and majors. I think that would be the case. Is there anything else that you'd like me to have our audience know about this book that would entice them to be reading it?
Yeah.
On their own time.
In everyone's spare time, which is so abundant, right?
That's why we try to, feature some of these more interesting types of maybe out of the box or things that are not your usual type of book in our series here. And I certainly thought that this book would fall into that category. Is there anything that you had in mind?
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm humbled that it fits in that very worthy project that you have. I guess what I would say is, for a number of years, I maintained a almost daily blog called Thinking on Music. I haven't written on there since 2019. It's still up, and I think I still get about maybe 2,000 views a month or whatever. So I feel like I shouldn't take it down. People are still looking at it. But the whole idea there was really looking at thinking on music a little more deeply. So kind of in a micro sense, some of the same topics, some different topics as well. But the idea of examining music on a deeper level than we might intuitively do. I think music is so experiential that it's not something we often think about. Probably your students do because they have to, but I think the general public, even people who use music on a daily basis, either as players or listeners or whatever, it doesn't necessarily attract the same kind of rigorous intellectual focus as some other subjects that are a little more generically brain centered, as it were, as opposed to emotion centered. So I say all of that because essentially what I want and what I hope readers take away from a book like this is that while they're reading it, and hopefully after they read it as well, they will think a little more deeply on the thing that they love, which is music. Most people do, just to kind of understand in a deeper way the various and many ways that music is integrated into our lives and the centrality of music in our lives. It's a kind of basic premise, but that's what I hope this book accomplishes.
Well, thank you. This has been really nice to hear from you about this book, and I hope our readers will be into it again. Music and Human Experience, Perspectives on a Musical Species. And it will be in your library. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us, Dr. Friedmann.
My pleasure. Thank you.